Our guest here is Sonia Benton, pronouns they, them, is a faculty member in the English and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department at Montana State University. They use they, them pronouns and identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community. They love facilitating, teaching both at the university and in the larger community, as well as do lots of work with the community about diversity and inclusion with various organizations. I'm going to hand it over to you, Sonia. Take the lead.
Yeah, awesome. Also, sorry, I feel like all of my official titles are such mouthfuls. But hi, everybody. It's so excited to see all of you on this kind of cloudy where I'm at, but hopefully sunny where everyone else is afternoon. So we're here to talk about hope. And I want to start off by kind of situating where I currently am. So right now I'm in Bozeman, Montana. I work at Montana State University, if you didn't get that from the bio. And right now in Montana, in the last few months, State Senator Zoe Zephyr was banned from speaking on the floor. David Gianforte tried to convince his father, our governor, not to pass legislation that harms him specifically. We have 2 House bills currently being passed to limit drag shows and the medical availability for trans youth. And then we also have Senate Bill 99, which is currently working its way through the K-12 system that prevents a lot of our public school teachers from speaking about any of the topics that this conference exists to talk about, as well as so much more. There's also been threats of violence and slurs that tear apart my students' worlds, and protesters against all of this have been arrested. Both in Helena and in Bozeman where I live, as well as in Great Falls and other towns here in Montana. So I want to really situate where we are in this time and to know that what's happening here where I live is not unique, right? This is something that we're seeing across our entire country. And even if it isn't local to where you live, that this is a possibility or a part of history or a thing happening just a couple hours away, right? And that oftentimes it looks like when we just look around at our general world that everywhere we fight, we're shut down. So what do you do in the face of something like this? In the face of a world that feels this heavy and hard for specifically the LGBTQ plus community. And for me, this is where I turn to history. So this is where I get to share slides. So give me a moment to get us all up there. Apologies. I know the progress flag is really bright, but hopefully still all the fonts should be pretty readable. Let me know if you're having trouble in the chat, and I'm happy to change that really fast. But I always start with looking at history, and the first place that we're going to start, because we're only going to look at 3 different historical events because my time is limited, is the Lavender Scare. So April 27th, just a couple days ago, actually the beginning of this summit, was the 70th anniversary of the Lavender Scare policies, which were implemented during the Cold War era. So 60s, 70s, 80s, 50s a little bit, right? And the Lavender Scare effectively banned LGBTQ plus people from working for the federal government, which included public schools, under the misguided fear that LGBTQ plus people were more likely to be easily manipulated by foreign spies and agents, which sounds really wildly unfounded, right? And that's because it was, right? This was a policy built upon bias, not upon actual science or fact or anything really rational, right? But it did not, none of that prevented 91 people from being fired by the State Department for being LGBTQ plus immediately. And after that point, right, this impacted a lot more federal government employees, including educators, at institutions like the ones that I currently work at, Montana State University, which is partially federally funded, right? So this rippled through the entire country and impacted a large portion of LGBTQ plus people. We actually don't have numbers that say exactly how many people lost their livelihoods during this time. We probably will never know those exact numbers, but this wasn't fully repealed. All of these laws were not fully repealed until 1995 by President Bill Clinton. I'm going to focus for a moment on one of these specific people that was impacted by this, because that's why this is important. Franklin Kameny, a former astronomer for the Army Map Service, appealed his dismissal and eventually made it all the way to the Supreme Court. He wasn't allowing these policies to go unopposed, and he certainly wasn't the only one fighting against them. But he started, along with other LGBTQ plus people that had been fired, the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C. And they filed suit after suit after suit, wrote countless letters to government officials of all type, as well as influential public speakers, including advice columnists and news reporters and a whole ton of other public figures. And they engaged in public demonstrations. This was a really long fight for this group, right? But they did manage to force the Lavender Scare policies out of civil government spaces, though not military ones, in 1975. Which sounds like a really long fight, and that's because it is, right? But they did succeed at least partially. And most of them continued that fight until their death, focusing on policies like don't ask, don't tell in the military and similar pieces. This branch of the Mattachine Society still exists today. They still do work. You can still look at their website. It's actually really interesting. But right, this is one very minimal example of what this has looked like in the past. We're going to go to another one that's also really relevant to our current time period. So this next Monday, May 1st, is the 53rd anniversary of a really related event. In 1969, the National Organization for Women, or now President Betty Friedan, referred to lesbians as a Lavender Menace within the organization. And a group of lesbians started to plan a counter to these statements via like a large theatrical action at the next year's NOW meeting. So in 1970, Michaela Griffo, Jessica Falstein, Carla Jay, and approximately 33 others hijacked the NOW meeting, wearing t-shirts that read Lavender Menace, seizing the floor, and captivating the audience with over 2 hours of Q&A and education on lesbianism. They did this via like turning off the lights. It was this big theatrical presentation. It was really funny. People really enjoyed it overall. And their message really connected with many other members of NOW that had felt excluded from the organization because of their skin color and socioeconomic status. Betty Friedan would eventually fully acknowledge her flawed view of lesbians within NOW in 1977 as a result of this group's kind of continued efforts to make that organization more inclusive of all the different types of women and others that are affected by what they do. So shortly after the AIDS epidemic began, 1981 was the first headline about the health scare. By that point, more than 6,000 people had already died of the disease in the US, and President Ronald Reagan had yet to address this at all. Sufferers and their loved ones were incited to act and created ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. That was roughly around 1985, though some dates vary depending on who you ask. But in 1987, after the death toll had reached 40,000, the community took action through 2 demonstrations on Wall Street in New York and a protest at the New York City Hall. So at this point, right, ACT UP was largely involved in these movements, but they would continue to create civil disobedience and to do marches and to write flyers and a whole bunch of other different pieces. And in 1990, Congress passed the Wainwright Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Care Act, which is a super long name that basically meant that people had to care and get involved in the fight against this disease, right? So why would these stories matter, right? Why am I talking about this at all during a presentation about hope, right? And I'm not even talking about a lot of the history. There's so many places and so many people to learn about in these. But I often teach this history for students, right? And this can feel even more hopeless knowing how long and bloody these struggles often were, right? These weren't without loss. They weren't without grief. They weren't without horror or hardship or difficulty, and they were long. But that's where I kind of disagree with my students, right? The fact that these were long and hard doesn't make them hopeless. Hopeless was essential for these movements. Hope is how we survived through these time periods as a community. Franklin Kemeny, who I mentioned earlier, wrote to President John F. Kennedy, "The homosexuals in this country are increasingly less willing to tolerate the abuse, repression, and discrimination directed at them, both officially and unofficially, and they're beginning to stand up for their rights and freedoms as citizens no less deserving than other citizens of those rights and freedoms. They are no longer willing to accept their present status as second-class human beings. They are neither. The winds of change are blowing. A wise and foresighted government will start now to take constructive action on this question." Carla J., one of the figures that I mentioned earlier, wrote in her memoir, "They'd never believed that despite the risk, I enjoyed almost every action. I thought we revolutionaries were changing the world. To a small degree, we did." And David Barr, a member of ACT UP, shared his feelings during that very first protest that I mentioned. "Rallying together and expressing our anger was a really good replacement for just feeling scared all the time. It felt powerful, and it gave us a way of saying, okay, we've got to do something more than just buy people groceries and take them to the hospital and plan memorial services. Anger is what helped us fight off a sense of hopelessness." And this is what's important, right? The fight was the source of hope, right? Hope isn't rooted, at least in queer history and activism, in the world that we want being within our reach. It is rooted in the fight itself, right? The power of seeing your community around you, of standing up to what you know is wrong, of standing up for what you believe to be right. It is about being able to look back and know you did not stand idly by as something happened in your community that you did not believe in. Rebecca Solnit wrote in Hope in the Dark, "Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act. When you recognize uncertainty, you recognize that you may be able to influence the outcomes, you alone, or you in concert with a few dozen others, or several million others. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable. It's the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact are not things we can know beforehand." Hope is so often talked about in, my culture, in the world that I live in here in the US, as this absence of despair, but I don't really agree with that, right? To do a quick linguistics lesson, despair comes from the same root word as desperate, right? And I and so many other activists are and have been desperate for change, for safety, for community, for acceptance, for something better, right? And hope and despair are the ways that we really feel this desperation. They are two sides of the same coin. They are the same root feeling, right? Recently, a student asked me how I stay hopeful and keep doing the work and how I keep surviving. Maybe some of that is spite, some of that anger that some of these quotes have gotten at, But honestly, I actually think my hope is radical because it comes from the knowledge that this is hard, that this is scary, that I am afraid, right? It comes from the gasping breath of the dying, from feeling like I am drowning. Because when someone drowns, they reach up towards somebody to save them. Because there is nothing else to do. And sure, yes, sometimes there is no one there, but sometimes there is. And the action is the same regardless. And throughout history, unexpectedly, there has more often been someone there than there hasn't been. When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. I think of this quote from Audre Lorde often. When I'm reaching for something better, when I'm working to be part of the future I envision, I am less afraid and I'm less hopeless, right? I feel like the fact that I am here and trying means so much, that it is important. And I get the same feeling from the works of Gloria Anzaldúa. Though we tremble before uncertain futures, may we meet illness, death, and adversity with strength when we dance in the face of our fears. My hope comes from my community, from their continued fight, from seeing people besides me really committed to this work, from being here at this summit, from having people show up to this talk, from having people watch this talk later, from knowing that this will be a resource that people can access in the future, from knowing that maybe one of the figures that I've shared will help somebody else be less hopeless, and be more hopeful. It comes from knowing that we've done this before, that this struggle isn't new, that it is continuing, that it has happened, that we're not alone, either in history or right now, that we are never alone, and that the fight will continue. I'm going to end with the words of Eliza Chavez, and just a quick warning. This quote is hard to hear, but I think it's important because I don't want to talk about hope that is easy. I want to talk about hope that's radical, right? And for me, this quote from Eliza Chavez is what it means to be hopeful against all odds. But finally, I found the argument against suicide, and it's us. We know everything we do is so the kids after us will be able to follow something towards safety. What can I call us but lighthouse? At this point, I want to give us all a second because I know that this is heavy and I know that this is hard and I know that you all came here to feel hopeful and that might not actually be what we're feeling right now. But I want to share that I think the most enduring form of hope is the one that is difficult, is the one that isn't happening because it's easy, but the one that's happening when it is hard. And I want to give us a moment to share with each other the things that make us feel hopeful, not the easy hope, but the things that really truly make us feel like we have an avenue to make the world a better place, that make us think that we might get somewhere better here. And we can have some time to think, have some silence, have a moment, and you're welcome to put this in the chat or in the Discord or pop off mute, whatever you're comfortable with. But I don't want this to just be me talking for an hour because I think that can be hard to listen to, at least for me. So a moment to kind of think and reflect and share.